The Imperium of Man, vast and labyrinthine, has its foundation in a history soaked in blood and fire. To understand the Dark Angels, the very first legion of the Emperor's mighty space marines, one must first journey back to the tumultuous age known as the Unification Wars. Terra, the birthplace of humanity's dominion, was in ruins, a ravaged world of techno-barbarian warlords, genetic monstrosities, and savage tribal factions. Out of this crucible of conflict arose the Emperor of Mankind, an enigmatic and godlike figure whose vision of unifying humanity would shape the galaxy for millennia to come. The Unification Wars were more than just a series of brutal battles. They were a campaign of ideological conquest, where ancient traditions, rival ideologies, and divergent human gene lines were either obliterated or subsumed under the Emperor's vision of a single, indivisible human species. This period saw the rise of Thunder Warriors, proto-Astartes created by the Emperor to crush his enemies, and the subsequent transition to the more refined and enduring Space Marines. But before even the concept of legions was fully realized, the Emperor had conceived of a project that would change the destiny of humanity, the creation of the Primarchs. It is important to understand that the First Legion was not merely the first in numerical order. It was the prototype upon which all future legions would be modeled. While the Emperor personally oversaw the creation of all the Primarchs and their respective legions, the First Legion was formed from the earliest and most stable gene seed derived from Lion L. Jonson, even before the Primarch himself was found. The First Legion's purpose was clear from the beginning: to be the Emperor's vanguard in his quest to reunite the fractured human worlds under his banner. Their name would later be known as the Dark Angels, but at their inception, they were simply the First. Unlike many of the later legions, the First was never tied to a particular world or culture. Their recruits were drawn from all across Terra, from the irradiated wastelands of Pan-Pacific to the techno-arcologies of old Europa. This broad base of recruitment gave the First Legion a distinct advantage. They were adaptable, pragmatic, and versatile in their methods of war. They were not bound by the customs or traditions of a single culture, which allowed them to act with cold efficiency, unburdened by sentiment or ritualistic excess. The First Legion embodied the Emperor's vision in its purest form: warriors who fought not for personal glory, but for the singular purpose of unifying humanity. During the Unification Wars, the First Legion was instrumental in crushing the most stubborn resistance across Terra. They were deployed against the Thunder tribes of the Himalayan plateau, whose warlords had fortified themselves in vast underground citadels. The First Legion, equipped with the earliest iterations of power armor and bolters, stormed these fortresses with ruthless precision. They were also present during the pacification of the Pan-Pacific Empire, where they eradicated gene cults that worshipped mutant overlords. In these early campaigns, the First Legion earned a reputation for being utterly relentless. They did not hesitate, they did not falter, and they left no enemy alive to spread dissent. One of the most pivotal moments in the formation of the First Legion's identity came during the battle for the Tempest Galleries, a sprawling network of subterranean tunnels that housed an ancient pre-imperial databank. The warlord who controlled the galleries had access to forbidden knowledge, technology, and lore that could have destabilized the Emperor's nascent regime. the First Legion was tasked with securing the site, and they did so with surgical precision. When they emerged from the depths, they brought with them not only the databank, but also the seeds of a belief that knowledge was a weapon more potent than any sword or bolter. This philosophy would later manifest in the Legion's obsession with secrecy and the safeguarding of ancient lore. The Emperor himself took a particular interest in the First Legion. He saw in them the perfect tools to carry out his will, especially in situations that required a more subtle or complex approach. While other proto-legions relied heavily on brute force, the First Legion demonstrated a capacity for strategy, misdirection, and psychological warfare. This made them invaluable during the later stages of the Unification Wars, when the Emperor faced increasingly sophisticated foes who understood that open warfare would lead to their swift defeat. The First Legion became the Emperor's scalpel, performing precise strikes to eliminate key threats before they could become insurmountable. As the Unification Wars drew to a close and the Emperor prepared to launch the Great Crusade, the First Legion underwent significant transformations. They were among the first to receive the newly developed gene seed enhancements that would become the hallmark of the Adeptus Astartes. This process refined their genetic structure, making them stronger, faster, and more resilient than the Thunder Warriors who had preceded them. It also gave them access to advanced war gear, Mark W power armor, prototype bolters, and a variety of war machines that would become iconic symbols of the Space Marine legions. With their transformation complete, the First Legion was ready to embark on the Great Crusade, a galaxy-spanning campaign to reunite humanity's scattered worlds under the banner of the Imperium. But even as they prepared to leave Terra, the seeds of their future identity as the Dark Angels were already being sown. The Emperor, ever mindful of the importance of symbolism, chose to adorn the First Legion with iconography that evoked ancient Terran myths of knights, angels, and protectors. Their armor was painted black, a color that symbolized both mystery and authority. Their banners bore the sigil of the winged sword, a symbol that would later come to represent both their nobility and their hidden shame. During the early stages of the Great Crusade, the First Legion quickly distinguished themselves as one of the most capable and adaptable legions. They were often tasked with the most challenging missions, those that required a combination of brute force and tactical cunning. One notable campaign was the conquest of the Lhasa Enclave, a rogue human polity that had managed to preserve pre-Dark Age technology. The First Legion's assault on Lhasa was a textbook example of their methodology, a swift, coordinated strike that neutralized the enemy's leadership and infrastructure before they could mount an effective defense. Within days, the Enclave was fully integrated into the Imperium. As the Great Crusade progressed, the First Legion continued to evolve. They began to develop their own unique traditions and practices, many of which were influenced by their experiences during the Unification Wars. One such tradition was the concept of the Inner Circle, a clandestine group within the Legion that held knowledge of the Emperor's true goals and the darkest secrets of humanity's past. This emphasis on secrecy and compartmentalization would become a defining characteristic of the Dark Angels, shaping their culture for millennia to come. The First Legion's adaptability was further demonstrated in their encounters with xenospecies during the early Crusade. While many legions approached alien species with straightforward hostility, the First Legion often took a more nuanced approach. They sought to understand their enemies, exploiting their weaknesses and using their own technologies against them. This pragmatic approach made them both feared and respected among the Imperium's foes. By the time the Emperor began the process of rediscovering the Primarchs, the First Legion had already established themselves as one of the most reliable and effective tools in his arsenal. They had fought across dozens of worlds, crushed countless enemies, and brought entire star systems into compliance. But their greatest test was yet to come, the moment when they would be reunited with their gene sire, the legendary Lion El Jonson, and begin the transformation from the First Legion to the Dark Angels as they are known today. However, before that momentous reunion, the First Legion laid the groundwork for their future legacy. Their early campaigns were marked by a relentless drive to achieve victory at any cost. They did not tolerate failure, nor did they permit weakness to fester within their ranks. They were warriors forged in the fires of Terra's darkest age, and their legacy would continue to shape the Imperium long after the last of the Unification War's embers had cooled. The transformation of the First Legion into the Dark Angels took root not just in Terra's wars, but on a world unlike any other, Caliban. It was here that their destiny would take shape, and here that the first Primarch would be discovered. To understand the Dark Angels' unique culture and their legacy of secrecy and shame, one must first understand the savage and mysterious world that birthed Lion El Jonson. Caliban was a death world, an unforgiving and wild place that stood apart from the rest of humanity's scattered remnants. Isolated from Terra during the long, dark millennia of the Age of Strife, the world had become a realm of superstition, survivalism, and knightly orders that battled endlessly against the monstrous creatures that prowled its endless forests. These weren't ordinary forests. They were ancient, dark, and oppressive, with trees so massive and twisted that their thick canopies blocked out sunlight for most of the day. The forest floor was a realm of perpetual dusk, where even the most seasoned hunters tread carefully. But it wasn't just the forests themselves that made Caliban so deadly. The land was stalked by beasts of nightmare, mutated beyond recognition by the genetic corruption that had plagued humanity since the fall of the Dark Age of technology. These creatures weren't merely dangerous predators. They were walking horrors, monstrous hybrids that defied biology. Some had the hulking forms of wolves, but with reptilian scales and venomous fangs. Others resembled great stags with razor-sharp antlers and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. These creatures, known collectively as the Great Beasts of Caliban, ruled the world's forests and threatened human settlements constantly. Life on Caliban revolved around survival. The human population lived in fortified enclaves surrounded by towering walls, ever vigilant against the dangers that lurked beyond. These settlements were organized around a strict feudal system, led by knightly orders that embodied ancient chivalric ideals, twisted to fit the brutal reality of their world. The largest and most respected of these orders was simply known as the Order. Its knights were sworn to protect humanity from the great beasts and maintain the fragile grasp of civilization on this perilous world. It was into this savage environment that Lion L. Jonson was born, or rather, appeared. His arrival on Caliban remains one of the great mysteries of the Warhammer universe. Like all the Primarchs, he was scattered across the galaxy during the cataclysmic event known as the Primarch Scattering, a plot by the Chaos Gods to thwart the Emperor's grand design. Unlike other Primarchs, who were discovered and taken in by their adoptive parents or rulers, the Lion's arrival was entirely unobserved. There were no witnesses to his birth or his fall to Caliban's surface. He simply emerged from the forest, alone and unprotected, a child surrounded by darkness and death. What makes the Lion's story unique is that he didn't grow up under the care of human guardians. For the first years of his life, he survived in the wilderness, completely alone. He was a child of the wilds, raised by no one and dependent only on his own instincts. For most, such a fate would mean certain death. But the Lion was no ordinary child. His Primarch genetics gave him strength, intelligence, and a preternatural ability to adapt to his surroundings. He became a part of the forest, a predator among predators. He hunted the great beasts not out of sport or necessity, but because they were his rivals in the brutal hierarchy of Caliban's wilderness. He learned their habits, understood their weaknesses, and became a creature of myth to those who feared the forest's dangers. The first humans to encounter Lion L. Jonson did so with fear and awe. There were stories, whispered tales of a wild man who stalked the dark woods, slaying beasts that even the bravest knights dared not confront. His presence became legend, a figure seen only as a fleeting shadow in the gloom. Eventually, it was Luther, a prominent knight of the Order, who would cross paths with the Lion in one of Caliban's most dangerous forests. Luther's encounter with the Lion was both serendipitous and fateful. On a routine hunt for a particularly fearsome great beast, a creature described as a wolf the size of a small fortress, with eyes like molten gold and fangs that dripped with acidic venom, Luther's party found themselves outmatched. The creature tore through the knight's defenses with savage ferocity. It was then that the Lion emerged from the shadows, a towering figure with long wild hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see straight into a man's soul. Without hesitation, he charged the beast, moving with a speed and strength that no human could match. The battle was over in moments. The Lion's blade, an improvised weapon made from the bones of a previous kill, struck true, and the monstrous wolf fell dead at his feet. Luther, awestruck by what he had witnessed, recognized the Lion's potential immediately. Here was no ordinary man. This was a warrior born of Caliban's very essence, a force of nature molded by the death world itself. Luther took it upon himself to bring the Lion back to the Order's fortress monastery. But while the knights saw a savior in the Lion, many also saw him as a threat to the existing power structure. His strength, intelligence, and charisma were undeniable, and it wasn't long before he rose through the ranks of the Order. Within a matter of years, Lion L. Jonson became the Grand Master of the Order, eclipsing even Luther, who had once been his mentor and closest ally. The Lion's vision for Caliban extended beyond mere survival. He saw a world where humanity could finally conquer the great beasts and reclaim the forests. Under his leadership, the knights embarked on a grand campaign to exterminate the creatures that had long plagued their world. This campaign was unprecedented in its scope and brutality. The knights, now united under the lion's command, hunted down the great beasts with relentless determination. No forest was too dense, no creature too fearsome. But it wasn't just his strength that made him a great leader. It was his strategic mind. He understood the value of patience and preparation, often spending days studying the habits of a particular beast before launching an attack. The lion himself often led these missions personally, particularly against the most formidable beasts. His presence on the battlefield was awe-inspiring. Clad in black armor, forged from the finest materials available on Caliban, he wielded a sword that had been passed down through the Order's generations, a blade reforged by his own hand to better suit his needs. His movements were calculated and efficient, every strike precise, every decision deliberate. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary flourishes or displays of bravado. The lion fought to kill, not to impress. His victories were swift and decisive, cementing his reputation as a leader without equal. However, as the great beasts were driven to extinction, new tensions began to emerge within the Order. Luther, still Lion's friend, began to question the lion's growing ambition. The man who had once been a solitary hunter in the woods was now a ruler, with the power to reshape Caliban's society. Some feared that the lion's rise heralded the end of the old ways, the traditions that had defined the Order for generations. Luther's words found sympathetic ears among those who felt that the lion's methods had become too harsh, too ruthless. Whispers of dissent began to spread, even as the lion continued his campaign. For his part, the lion seemed unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the growing divide between himself and Luther. He remained focused on his goal, to create a world free of the chaos and danger that had defined Caliban for so long. He believed that unity was the key to achieving that goal, and that unity could only be achieved through absolute control. As the campaign drew to a close, the lion declared Caliban cleansed of its ancient horrors. The great beasts were no more, and the once impenetrable forests had been tamed. Human civilization flourished, and the Order stood as the dominant power on the planet. But beneath the surface, the seeds of rebellion had already been planted. The lion's rise to power had come at a cost, the cost of trust, loyalty, and the friendship he had once shared with Luther. The two men, once inseparable, now stood on opposite sides of an ideological divide. And as the galaxy would soon learn, even the strongest bonds can be broken. It was during this period of rising tension that the Emperor of Mankind arrived on Caliban. The Emperor's arrival was both a blessing and a curse for the lion. On the one hand, it validated everything he had achieved. The Emperor recognized in the lion a kindred spirit, a leader forged by hardship and driven by an unshakable vision. On the other hand, it introduced new pressures and expectations that would sow the seeds of future discord. For now, though, the lion stood at the height of his power. Caliban was secure and unified, and its people looked to him as both a savior and a leader. Lionel Jonson's story was just beginning. What had once been a world ruled by fear and superstition became a beacon of order and stability. The great beasts were gone, the forests tamed, and human civilization flourished under the strict but visionary leadership of the lion and his knightly order. Yet, for all his accomplishments, Lionel Jonson remained an isolated figure. driven by an inner resolve that few could fully understand. He saw Caliban as his responsibility, a world he had saved from destruction. But his vision for Caliban, and perhaps his own destiny, would soon change in ways even he couldn't anticipate. The arrival of the Emperor of Mankind was a turning point in both the Lion's life and the fate of the First Legion. It was an event that in many ways would shape the entire course of Imperial history. The Emperor's coming was sudden and unexpected, but it was far from random. He had been searching for his lost sons, the Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy by the forces of chaos. When his fleet arrived in orbit over Caliban, the Emperor knew that he had found another of his long-lost children. The Emperor's arrival was heralded by the descent of vast, golden-hulled warships that darkened the skies over the planet's capital. For the people of Caliban, who had lived in relative isolation from the galaxy at large, the sight of the Emperor's fleet was akin to witnessing the arrival of a god. And in many ways, they weren't far from the truth. The Emperor descended to the surface in full regalia, his golden armor shining with a light that seemed to pierce the darkened skies of Caliban. His presence was overwhelming, radiating authority, wisdom, and a quiet, unshakable power. Lionel Jonson, however, did not fall to his knees as many others did. Instead, he greeted the Emperor as a peer, recognizing in this towering figure something he had never seen in another being, a mind and purpose that mirrored his own. The Lion was never one for idle reverence, and he had no time for rituals of worship. Instead, he offered the Emperor something far more valuable: loyalty. The Emperor, in turn, recognized in the Lion a kindred spirit. He saw in this solitary, stoic figure a Primarch who had already proven his worth by conquering a world without any assistance. Unlike some of the other Primarchs who had grown up in relative luxury or had inherited established kingdoms, the Lion had built his domain from the ground up, carving civilization out of a savage wilderness. The Emperor saw in him the potential to be one of his greatest generals, a leader who could command not only through strength, but through discipline and strategic brilliance. As the two spoke, it became clear that their goals aligned. The Emperor offered the Lion command of the First Legion, the earliest of the Space Marine legions that had been fighting for decades before the Lion's discovery, but their identity had not yet fully formed. With their Primarch now at the helm, the First Legion began to take on the traits that defined Lionel Jonson: discipline, secrecy, and an unyielding focus on the mission. Under his leadership, they became known as the Dark Angels, the Emperor's shadowed knights. The Lion's induction into the wider Imperium was seamless. He quickly assumed control of the Dark Angels, and their transformation into the most secretive and methodical of the Space Marine legions began in earnest. Under the Lion's command, they became the Emperor's problem solvers, sent to the most difficult battlefields and tasked with the most complex missions. They were the hammer when brute force was required, and the scalpel when precision was necessary. But through it all, the Lion instilled in them an obsession with secrecy, a trait that would later define both their greatest strengths and their darkest failings. One of the Dark Angel's earliest campaigns under the Lion's command was the raising of Sarosh, a battle that perfectly encapsulated the Legion's new methods of warfare. Sarosh was a human world that had resisted compliance with the Imperium. On the surface, the planet's leaders had pledged loyalty to the Emperor, but in truth, they were harboring dangerous ideologies and forbidden technologies that posed a threat to Imperial stability. Dark angels descended on Sarosh with ruthless efficiency, cutting off the planet's communication networks and crippling its defenses before a single shot was fired in open combat. The final assault on Sarosh was brutal and uncompromising. The Lion led his forces personally, targeting key infrastructure and leadership with surgical precision. His tactics were not about conquering territory, but about neutralizing threats before they could escalate. When the dust settled, Sarosh was a broken world, its treacherous rulers dead or captured, and its people brought into compliance under a strict oversight. This campaign set the tone for the Dark Angel's role in the Great Crusade. The Lion's approach was always the same: strike first, strike hard, and leave no room for ambiguity. However, the Lion's methods didn't always sit well with his brother Primarchs. Some, like Robute Guilliman, saw the Dark Angels as overly secretive and distrustful. Others, like Leman Russ, viewed the Lion's cold, calculating demeanor as a sign of arrogance. But the Lion wasn't interested in earning the approval of his brothers. His focus was always on the mission, and he expected the same from his legion. As the Great Crusade progressed, the Dark Angels continued to build their reputation as one of the most reliable and effective legions. They took on missions that other legions would balk at, campaigns that required not just military might, but political acumen and psychological warfare. Yet, through it all, the Lion remained distant and enigmatic. He rarely engaged in the camaraderie that many of the other Primarchs shared. He saw his brothers as equals in theory, but in practice, he often viewed them as distractions from the larger goal. His relationship with the Emperor was similarly reserved. While other Primarchs sought their father's approval, the Lion seemed content to carry out his duties without fanfare or recognition. As the Great Crusade stretched across the stars, the Imperium of Man seemed unstoppable. One by one, humanity's lost worlds were brought back into compliance under the Emperor's banner. The Primarchs and their legions acted as his warlords, each embodying a facet of his grand vision for the future. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Old resentments, ideological differences, and personal ambitions brewed among the Emperor's sons. The seeds of betrayal were being sown, and the galaxy would soon be consumed by the Horus Heresy, the most catastrophic civil war in human history. For the Dark Angels, the heresy marked a period of isolation and internal conflict. While other legions were drawn into the heart of the rebellion, the Dark Angels found themselves far from Terra, caught in battles that would leave them absent from the war's most pivotal moments. Yet their role in the heresy was anything but passive. The first whispers of treachery came from Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's favored son and the war master of the Great Crusade. Horus had been given command of the entire expeditionary force, a position that many of his brothers resented. For Lion L. Jonson, however, the appointment of Horus was a practical decision, one he neither openly supported nor opposed. The Lion had little interest in the politics of the Primarch's hierarchy. His focus remained on the mission at hand, securing humanity's future through strength and unity. But as the heresy began to unfold, it became clear that the divide among the Primarchs was deeper than anyone had anticipated. Several legions, including the sons of Horus, Wordbearers, and Death Guard, openly declared their allegiance to Horus, turning against the Emperor. These legions were driven by various motives: ambition, ideological differences, or manipulation by the forces of chaos. The loyalist Primarchs, including Guilliman, Dorn, and Sanguinius, quickly rallied to the Emperor's side, preparing to defend Terra from the impending assault. Lion L. Jonson's reaction to the news of Horus's betrayal was characteristically stoic and pragmatic. There is little record of the Lion expressing shock or outrage at the War Master's actions. Instead, he immediately set about reorganizing his forces, preparing the Dark Angels for the inevitable conflict. Yet, the Lion's strategic mind led him to a different conclusion than his brothers. While many of the loyalist legions rushed to Terra to defend the Imperial Palace, the Lion chose a different path. He believed that the war would not be won by defensive actions alone. To him, the key to victory lay in cutting off the traitors' supply lines and eliminating their leadership through calculated strikes. This decision would prove controversial. While the siege of Terra raged on, the Dark Angels were notably absent, engaged in campaigns far from the heart of the Imperium. The Lion's focus was on the eastern fringe, where he believed he could disrupt Horus's plans by neutralizing key traitor strongholds and securing vital supply routes. In hindsight, this strategy was sound, but it came at a cost. The Dark Angel's absence from Terra during the siege would be a point of contention for centuries to come. While the siege of Terra captured the attention of the galaxy, the Dark Angels were waging their own war on multiple fronts. One of the most significant campaigns during this period was the Thramas Crusade, a brutal conflict against the traitorous Night Lords, led by Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. The war between the Dark Angels and Night Lords was a clash of opposites: the calculated discipline of the Dark Angels versus the sadistic terror tactics of the Night Lords. The Thramas Crusade was a war of attrition, fought across dozens of worlds. The Night Lords, true to their nature, sought to sow fear and chaos, targeting civilian populations and engaging in psychological warfare. The Dark Angels, under the Lion's command, responded with ruthless efficiency, systematically dismantling the Night Lords' operations and denying them the opportunity to spread their terror. It was during this campaign that the Lion's tactical brilliance truly shone. He employed hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and feints to keep the Night Lords off balance, exploiting their reliance on terror to make them predictable. Yet, the war against the Night Lords was a bitter, personal conflict. The Lion and Conrad Kurz were ideological opposites, but they shared a deep mutual disdain. Kurz, ever the nihilist, viewed the Lion as a hypocrite, a ruler who claimed to uphold order and justice, but whose methods were just as ruthless as his own. The Lion, in turn, saw Kurz as an abomination, a creature who had abandoned all sense of duty and honor. Their confrontations were intense and deeply personal, with each viewing the other as the embodiment of everything they despised. Despite their differences, there were moments during the Thramas Crusade where the lines between the two Primarchs blurred. Both were willing to make hard, morally ambiguous decisions to achieve victory. The Lion showed little mercy to those he deemed threats to the Imperium, whether they were traitors or civilians who stood in his way. This unyielding approach earned him both respect and fear within his own legion. Throughout the heresy, the lion's mistrust of his fellow Primarchs deepened. Even among the loyalists, he saw weakness and indecision. He viewed many of his brothers as too emotional, too driven by personal relationships and grudges to see the bigger picture. He believed that the fate of the Imperium depended on cold, calculated decisions that many of his brothers were unwilling to make. This mistrust was most evident in the relationship between Lion L. Jonson and Rogal Dorn. Their differing philosophies on warfare created an underlying tension. Dorn, ever the staunch defender, focused on fortifying the Imperial Palace to withstand the coming assault from Horus. The Lion, however, saw warfare as a strategic puzzle to be solved, favoring preemptive strikes and calculated maneuvers over static defense. Their disagreements never boiled over into outright conflict, but the Lion's absence from Terra during the siege left Dorn and others questioning the First Legion's priorities. While the Lion's reasons were sound, the lingering mistrust endured for centuries. Even after the heresy ended, the Lion's mistrust of his brothers persisted. He believed that the Imperium's survival depended on secrecy and control, values that would shape the future of the Dark Angels. His actions during the heresy were driven by an unwavering loyalty to the Emperor, but that loyalty came at a price. The Lion was willing to sacrifice trust, camaraderie, and even his own humanity to achieve victory. While the rest of the galaxy reeled from the aftermath of the siege of Terra, the Lion returned to Caliban, unaware that the seeds of betrayal had already taken root. He found a world that no longer welcomed him. The warriors he had left behind, once loyal knights of the Order and newly inducted Astartes, now stood with Luther. Caliban, the planet he had fought so hard to tame and protect, had become a bastion of heresy. The Dark Angels stationed there had turned against their Gene Father, seduced by Luther's rhetoric and their own growing disillusionment with the Imperium. It was a schism within the very heart of the Dark Angels. These were his people, the knights he had once fought alongside, the brothers he had sworn to protect, and leading them was Luther, the man who had once been his closest ally. The battle for Caliban was brutal and unforgiving. The Lion's forces, hardened veterans of the heresy, descended upon the planet with the precision and ruthlessness that the Dark Angels were known for. But they faced stiff resistance from Luther's forces, who knew the terrain intimately and had spent years preparing for this moment. The forests of Caliban became battlefields, the once majestic trees reduced to shattered wreckage as bolter fire and plasma blasts tore through the landscape. The skies burned with the glow of orbital bombardments, and the very ground trembled under the weight of war machines. Yet, through the chaos and destruction, the Lion had one goal: to confront Luther personally. He needed answers. Why had his brother turned against him? What had driven him to betray everything they had built together? The Lion, despite his stoic demeanor, was a man driven by a sense of duty and justice. He could not comprehend the depth of Luther's betrayal, nor could he understand the pain and envy that had consumed his former mentor. The two finally met within the ruins of the Order's fortress monastery, a place that had once been a symbol of unity and purpose. Now, it stood as a shattered relic of the past, its walls scarred by battle, and its halls echoing with the distant sounds of war. When Lion L. Jonson entered the inner sanctum of the fortress monastery of Alduric, Luther was waiting for him. The confrontation between the two former brothers was inevitable. It was not a battle of words or ideologies. It was a brutal, physical confrontation, the culmination of years of betrayal and mistrust. Their blows shook the very foundations of the fortress, and the sounds of their clash echoed through the ruins like thunder. The once proud monastery crumbled around them as they fought for the soul of the Dark Angels. In the heat of battle, Luther unleashed a powerful psychic attack, one fueled by the dark powers of chaos. The attack struck the lion down, grievously wounding him. As Luther stood over his fallen brother, he realized the depth of his mistake. He saw the destruction wrought upon Caliban, the devastation of their once proud world, and the ruin his actions had brought. Overwhelmed by guilt and despair, Luther collapsed, dropping his weapon and refusing to fight any further. It was then that a massive warp rift erupted, unleashed by the powers of chaos. The storm tore through Caliban, shattering the planet and reducing it to rubble and debris. Realizing that Caliban was lost, the remaining Dark Angels fled to their ships, evacuating the planet before the warp storm consumed them. As they broke orbit, they watched in sorrow as their homeworld was torn apart, leaving only a single massive asteroid, the Rock, floating in the void. This fragment of Caliban would become their new fortress monastery, a constant reminder of their shame and loss. In the aftermath, Lionel Jonson vanished. His loyal sons searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. The most widely accepted belief is that the Watchers in the dark took the lion's wounded body to a hidden chamber deep within the rock, where he remained in stasis for 10,000 years. The destruction of Caliban wasn't just the loss of a homeworld. It was the moment that defined the Dark Angel's future, a future built on secrecy, shame, and relentless pursuit of redemption. When the battle between Lionel Jonson and Luther tore the planet apart, scattering the fallen angels across the galaxy, the Dark Angels were left with more than just physical ruin. They were left with a wound to their honor that would never fully heal. What followed was not a public declaration of vengeance, nor an open crusade to set things right. Instead, it became a quiet, relentless mission of penance, one that would define their existence for the millennia to come. Within the chapter itself, a grim vow was made. They would hunt down the fallen, those traitorous brethren who had turned against their Primarch, and bring them back to the rock to face judgment. The Dark Angels believed that their chapter's very soul was stained by the events on Caliban, and the only way to cleanse that stain was to capture the fallen and make them repent. Yet this was no simple task. The fallen had been scattered across the galaxy, some aligning themselves with chaos, others going into hiding, and a few becoming warlords in their own right. Tracking them down was a monumental task, one that would take thousands of years and span countless worlds. But the Dark Angels accepted this burden without question. They had no choice. Their shame was a weight they couldn't cast off, and their hunt for the fallen became their all-consuming purpose. As the centuries passed, the chapter created successor chapters, each sworn to the same secretive mission. These chapters became known collectively as the Unforgiven, a fitting name for warriors who carried the burden of a sin they could never fully expunge. The Unforgiven operated as independent chapters, but they maintained a shadow network of communication with the Dark Angels, all of them bound by their shared mission to hunt the fallen. From an outsider's perspective, the Unforgiven seemed like any other loyalist Space Marine chapters. They fought in Imperial campaigns, defended humanity from Xenos threats, and purged heretical elements. But behind the scenes, they had their own agenda, one that often took precedence over any other duty. If word of a fallen angel's presence reached the ears of the Inner Circle, the Unforgiven would drop everything to pursue that lead. Entire battle companies would be redirected, sometimes even entire chapters mobilized to capture a single fallen angel. This obsession with the hunt bred mistrust. Other loyalist chapters and Imperial officials noticed that the Dark Angels and their successors often seemed aloof and uncooperative. They rarely shared information about their campaigns, and their motives were often unclear. The Dark Angels answered to no one outside their own ranks. They kept their own counsel and pursued their own missions, often without explaining their actions to those around them. The Inner Circle of the Dark Angels is more than a council of leaders. It is a shadow government within the chapter itself, with carefully controlled tiers of knowledge. For the Dark Angels, knowledge is both power and a curse. The truth about the fall of Caliban is not something that can be shared openly, not even with most of their own battle brothers. Instead, this truth is doled out in pieces, carefully measured and granted only to those who prove themselves worthy and who demonstrate an unwavering loyalty that goes beyond mere battlefield prowess. The structure of the Inner Circle is built like a labyrinth of trust and secrecy, with each layer representing a deeper level of understanding. At the outermost layer are the chaplains, who begin to learn that the chapter's history is not as noble or untarnished as the official records suggest. From there, captains and masters are slowly inducted into the mysteries until they reach the highest echelons of the Inner Circle, where the full truth of the fallen is revealed. But even at the top, knowledge is compartmentalized. No one speaks freely of the fallen outside of Inner Circle gatherings. This secrecy isn't just paranoia, it's a matter of survival. The Dark Angels know that if the wider Imperium ever learned the truth about their chapter's internal betrayal, it could lead to their downfall. In the Imperium, loyalty is everything, and the revelation that the First Legion, the oldest and most venerated of all Space Marine legions, was fractured by treachery could shatter the trust they have worked so hard to maintain. The stakes are too high. The secret must be kept at all costs. The Inner Circle oversees two of the most important formations within the Dark Angels, the Deathwing and the Raven Wing. These specialized companies are the sharpest tools the Dark Angels wield in their hunt for the fallen, and their roles are closely tied to the chapter's secretive mission. The Deathwing, clad in their iconic bone-white Terminator armor, are the chapter's elite warriors, tasked with carrying out the most dangerous missions. But their true purpose goes beyond mere combat prowess. The Deathwing are the executioners of the Inner Circle's will. They are deployed in missions where the capture or execution of a fallen angel is the objective, and they are trained to operate without question or hesitation. Every member of the Deathwing knows some fragment of the truth about the fallen, though the extent of their knowledge varies depending on their rank. Those inducted into the Deathwing are chosen not just for their martial skill, but for their loyalty and trustworthiness. Once inducted, they are marked forever by the knowledge they carry, and there is no turning back. Unlike the Deathwing, who bring brute force to bear, the Ravenwing operates with speed, precision, and secrecy. The Ravenwing Company is made up of highly mobile bike and land speeder squadrons, tasked with tracking down and locating the fallen. The Ravenwing's tactics are built around swift reconnaissance, surgical strikes, and rapid redeployment, allowing them to hunt their prey across vast distances before calling in the Deathwing to finish the job. Their black armor and fast-moving formations are a stark contrast to the bone white of the Deathwing, symbolizing their role as seekers of truth, hidden in the shadows. Among the fallen angels, Cypher is the most infamous one, a shadowy, enigmatic figure who has eluded capture for millennia. His motives and allegiances are a mystery, even to the Dark Angels. Some say he seeks to atone for his sins, while others believe he is working to bring about the downfall of the Imperium itself. What makes Cypher so dangerous isn't just his skill with a blade or his uncanny ability to disappear without a trace. It's what he carries with him. Cypher is almost always depicted carrying an ancient broken sword, rumored to be the Lion Sword, the very blade wielded by Lion L. Jonson himself. The symbolism of the broken sword is not lost on the Dark Angels. To them, it represents their fractured legacy and the possibility of redemption or destruction. Some within the inner circle believe that Cypher seeks to return the sword to Terra, to present it to the Emperor himself. What would happen if he succeeded is unknown. Would the Emperor grant the Dark Angels forgiveness, or would he condemn them for their failure? Others believe Cypher's goals are more sinister, that he seeks to reunite the fallen and lead a new rebellion against the Imperium. His appearances are always shrouded in mystery, and he often arrives at key moments of galactic significance, as though he is playing a game of his own design. The Dark Angels have pursued Cypher across countless worlds, yet he always slips through their grasp. To the Dark Angels, Cypher is the ultimate prize, the one fallen angel who holds the key to their redemption or their ruin. In the dark and fragmented galaxy of the 42nd millennium, the chapter's clandestine pursuits continue, even as the Imperium itself teeters on the brink of collapse. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that tore the galaxy in two, plunged the Imperium into an age of unprecedented peril. The galaxy is now split between Imperium Sanctus, still faintly illuminated by the light of the Astronomicon, and Imperium Nihilus, an uncharted nightmare realm shrouded in darkness, cut off from Terra and the Emperor's guiding light. It is in this fractured age that the Dark Angel's secretive nature clashes with the wider Imperium's desperate need for unity, especially under the leadership of Robute Guilliman, the returned Primarch of the Ultramarines. The arrival of Guilliman in the 42nd millennium marked a seismic shift in the Imperium's fortunes. After being resurrected with the aid of the Inari and the mysterious Eldar artifact known as the Hand of Darkness, Guilliman wasted no time in assuming command of the crumbling Imperium. As Lord Commander of the Imperium, he launched the Indomitus Crusade, a vast military campaign to reinforce the Imperium's worlds and hold back the tides of Chaos and Xenos incursions. The Dark Angels, with their ancient legacy and reputation for martial excellence, were a critical part of this effort. Their reputation as the First Legion, the Emperor's original and most venerated Astartes force, ensured that they would be heavily involved in securing key sectors of the Imperium Nihilus. Yet, for all their contributions to the Indamitis Crusade, Guilliman quickly found the Dark Angels to be a perplexing ally. Where other loyalist chapters operated with transparency and zeal, the Dark Angels remained distant and secretive, often refusing to disclose their full objectives or the true purpose of their deployments. Guilliman, ever the master tactician and politician, recognized that this was no ordinary reticence. The Dark Angels were hiding something, and their evasive answers only deepened his suspicion. As the Indamitis Crusade raged across the galaxy, the Dark Angels found themselves uniquely suited to operating within Imperium Nihilus. The Dark Angels had always been a chapter that thrived on the fringes, away from the core worlds of the Imperium, conducting their missions in shadowy theaters of war where few could observe their actions. The chaotic, isolated nature of Imperium Nihilus provided them with the perfect cover to continue their ancient hunt for the fallen angels without drawing the scrutiny of Guilliman or other Imperial forces. In many ways, Imperium Nihilus became the perfect hunting ground for the Dark Angels, a realm of darkness and lawlessness where whispers of ancient heresies could be tracked without interference from the wider Imperium. Under the command of Supreme Grand Master Azrael, the Dark Angels deployed their forces with characteristic precision. They were among the first to integrate the new Primaris Space Marines gifted to them by Guilliman, incorporating these reinforcements into both the Deathwing and Ravenwing with ruthless efficiency. However, the introduction of the Primaris Marines raised an uncomfortable question for the Dark Angels' leadership. Could these new warriors be trusted with the chapter's most guarded secrets? The answer, at least at first, was a resounding no. The Dark Angels maintained their layers of secrecy, carefully controlling what the Primaris were allowed to know and ensuring that only those who proved themselves worthy would be inducted into the inner circle. During the later stages of the Indamitis Crusade, tension between the Dark Angels and Robut Guilliman began to grow. Guilliman became increasingly frustrated by the chapter's secretive nature and their frequent deviations from imperial orders. The Dark Angels often redirected their forces to pursue leads on fallen angels, abandoning assigned missions without explanation. Though Guilliman suspected something was amiss, Azrael offered only vague reassurances, deflecting any direct inquiries into the chapter's activities. The mistrust between Guilliman and the Dark Angels continued to simmer, with Guilliman remaining deeply wary of the First Legion's true motivations. To Guilliman, the Dark Angel's behavior was unacceptable. As the Lord Commander of the Imperium, he valued order, transparency, and accountability, values that the Dark Angels seemed to disregard entirely. Guilliman's frustration was rooted in more than just their actions during the Indamitis Crusade. It was their entire demeanor, their refusal to share information, and their consistent tendency to act outside the chain of command. He knew that they were hiding something significant, but he couldn't prove it. Guilliman's analytical mind recognized the pattern of evasion and secrecy for what it was, a deliberate effort to conceal a dark truth. Despite his suspicions, Guilliman couldn't afford to alienate the Dark Angels entirely. Their martial prowess and strategic expertise were too valuable in the ongoing war against chaos, particularly in the tumultuous regions of Imperium Nihilus. The Dark Angels delivered results, and their campaigns were often critical to securing key worlds and stabilizing entire sectors. Guilliman tolerated their secrecy for the sake of the larger war effort, but he never fully trusted them. For their part, the Dark Angels remained resolute in their mission. The hunt for the fallen continued unabated, with the chapter deploying both the Deathwing and Ravenwing to track down leads across the shattered Imperium. The Ravenwing's speed and mobility allowed them to gather intelligence and track potential targets, while the Deathwing delivered the crushing force required to capture or eliminate the fallen. Every mission was conducted with absolute secrecy, with the inner circle overseeing each operation to ensure that no details leaked beyond the chapter's walls. The return of Lion L. Jonson to the galaxy was as mysterious and unsettling as his disappearance. For millennia, the Imperium believed the Lion lost, a tragic casualty of the conflict that destroyed Caliban and scattered his legion. His name endured in legend, spoken with reverence and regret among the Dark Angels and their unforgiven successors. But in the darkest age of the Imperium, as the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half and plunged Imperium Nihilus into shadow, the Lion stirred once more. His awakening, however, was not in the familiar halls of the Rock or on any known world. It was in a place far stranger, Mirror Caliban, a realm both hauntingly familiar and alien. When Lion L. Jonson opened his eyes for the first time in millennia, he found himself in Mirror Caliban, a realm that seemed to be a twisted, dreamlike reflection of the Caliban he once knew. The dark forests loomed around him, their ancient trees twisting into unnatural shapes, and the air was heavy with sorrow. He walked in silence, his mind blank, his memory shattered. As he wandered, he came upon a river, its waters flowing with a strange, melodic sound. There, a watcher in the dark appeared, greeting him with the cryptic word, "Home." Confused and wary, the Lion questioned the watcher. "Where am I?" he asked. But true to their nature, the watcher offered little explanation. Instead, it urged the Lion to follow his nature. Following his instincts, the Lion pressed onward through the forest, catching the scent of corruption on the wind. His journey took him to Kamarth, a desolate, ruined world, where he encountered Zabriel, a fallen angel from his past. Seeing Zabriel jolted the Lion's shattered memories back into place. The betrayal of Caliban, his duel with Luther, and the fall of his legion all flooded back to him. The Lion's gaze hardened as clarity returned. He was no longer a wandering soul. He was Lion L. Jonson, Primarch of the First Legion. Zabriel, standing before his Genefather, expressed deep regret for his past sins. He explained how the Imperium had long since branded him and other fallen as irredeemable. The Lion listened in silence, his piercing gaze never wavering. When Zabriel finished, the Lion spoke, "Then fight with me. Help me make things right." Thus began the formation of the Risen, a warband of loyalist fallen angels dedicated to redeeming themselves through battle. As the Lion traveled through Mirror Caliban, he discovered his ability to shape the realm through sheer willpower, allowing him to move across the galaxy through the forest walk. He used this power to lead his growing force of Risen into battle against the enemies of the Imperium, striking at chaos warbands and heretical forces across Imperium Nihilus. The Lion's campaign eventually brought him into direct conflict with Seraphax, a fallen sorcerer lord who sought to use the Lion's body to assassinate the Emperor. The Lion, ever the tactician, allowed himself to be captured briefly, learning Seraphax's plan before turning the tables on the sorcerer. With the help of the Risen, the Lion defeated Seraphax, leaving his twisted ambitions in ruins. Continuing his campaign, the Lion arrived on Wormwood, where he met Dante, the regent of Imperium Nihilus. The meeting was one of shock and revelation, especially when Dante informed the Lion of Guilliman's return. The Lion was visibly unsettled, harboring a deep mistrust of his brother's vision for the Imperium. Their alliance was tested when Angron, the demon Primarch, launched an assault on the Idolatros system. Using his forest walk ability, the Lion appeared in the midst of the battle on Wormwood, saving Dante from Angron's fury. The two Primarchs clashed in a brutal duel, their combat shaking the very ground beneath them. In the end, the Lion defeated Angron, using the Emperor's shield to drive the demon Primarch back. Following this victory, the Lion was declared the Knight of Nihilus, a title symbolizing his new role as the protector of the darkened half of the Imperium. But the Lion himself remained conflicted, increasingly disillusioned with what the Imperium had become. Wherever he went, he demanded reform, bypassing imperial officials to speak directly to the people, heralding vast regime changes with his presence alone. The reunion between Lion L. Jonson and Robud Guilliman has the potential to be one of the most significant events in the Imperium's recent history, but it is fraught with tension and uncertainty. The Lion and Guilliman, though both loyal sons of the Emperor, have vastly different visions for the Imperium. Guilliman's Codex Astartes, written in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, reshaped the Space Marines into smaller, more independent chapters, dismantling the legions to prevent future rebellion. The Lion, however, has no knowledge of this document or the sweeping reforms Guilliman implemented. To the Lion, the Dark Angels are still the First Legion, and his leadership will undoubtedly challenge the modern structure of the chapter and its unforgiven successors. The Lion's personality, stern, pragmatic, and deeply distrustful, stands in stark contrast to Guilliman's more diplomatic and administrative approach. Where Guilliman sees bureaucracy and structure as necessary to maintain the Imperium, the Lion sees corruption, decay, and weakness. His disdain for the Imperium's current state will likely put him at odds with Imperial officials and Guilliman himself, especially when it comes to reforming the Imperium Nihilus, which the Lion now views as his domain. The Dark Angels, already known for their secrecy and self-reliance, may double down on their isolationist tendencies under the Lion's leadership, rejecting Guilliman's calls for transparency and unity. Speculation about the future of the Dark Angels centers on how the chapter will reconcile its past sins with its future role in the Imperium. The Lion's return and his knowledge of the fallen could push the chapter to finally confront its dark legacy. Yet, the hunt for the fallen will likely remain an obsession, and the Lion may even demand that other unforgiven chapters rejoin the First Legion under his command, creating a new power block within the Imperium. The future of the Imperium Secundus vision, which the Lion once begrudgingly supported, may resurface, particularly if the rift between Guilliman and the lion deepens. What is clear, however, is that the lion's presence will reshape the galaxy once more, for better or worse. The Imperium Nihilus has a new Knight Protector, and the lion has returned to finish what he started long ago, to cleanse the Imperium of corruption and betrayal by any means necessary.